Hello, everyone. We are Group 8. Our serial killer project is on Juana Barraza. I'm Cindy.
I'm Natalie.
I'm Jolene.
And I'm Jeanette.
So I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about Juana Barraza's childhood, upbringing, and adult life, and the reasoning as to why many believe that the killings were her way of dealing with lingering resentment towards a parent who betrayed her. Next slide. Juana Barraza was born on December 27th, 1957 in Hidalgo, Mexico. Like many serial killers, Barraza had endured a horrific childhood of poverty and abuse. When she was just 12 years old, her alcoholic mother sold her to a drinking buddy in exchange for 3 beers. Barraza was reportedly abused repeatedly by the man who treated her as his own personal sex slave. Next slide. Juana was a single mother of 4 children. She supported her family with her professional wrestling career. Juana wrestled under the ring name of La Dama del Silencio, which means the Lady of Silence. She was reportedly thriving in the wrestling industry and had enough strength to bench press over 220 pounds. She wrestled until a back injury forced her to retire. Juana then turned to robbery and murder to make ends meet. Next slide. Juana had a rough life. There were many internal factors in her childhood and adulthood that could have caused her trauma and contributed to homicide. As previously mentioned, Juana had a rough upbringing with an abusive and alcoholic mother. She was sold off and repeatedly raped. She developed a deep-rooted hatred for her mother, which became her motive for murder. Her crimes against the older women were a sort of revenge against her mother. In her adult life, Juana dealt with loss in different forms. She dealt with the loss of her oldest son, who died of his injuries after being attacked with a baseball bat. And she was forced to give up wrestling after an injury, which provided for her family, forcing her to turn to a life of crime. Next slide.
Hello, everyone. I am Jeanette, and I will be telling you about the crimes that Juana Barraza committed. So Juana Barraza would gain entrance to the homes of elderly women by pretending to help carry in groceries or dressed as a nurse or social worker, claiming to be sent by the Mexican government for medical or welfare assistance. She managed to acquire a list of women who were on a government assistance program. She used this list to identify elderly women who lived alone and used fake credentials to pretend that she was a nurse sent by the government to check their vital signs. Once inside, she would pick a weapon, like a set of stockings or a telephone cord, and strangle them. Barraza would then look through her victims' houses for something to take with her. She would take a small memento from her victims, like a religious trinket. As you can see on the slide in front of you, the victims were elderly women. The victims lived alone. The victims died by strangulation, and Barraza did not enter the homes by force. When Juana Barraza was detained, she was asked by Mexican officials to show them how she strangled her victims. She proceeded to do so. She stated that she would grab tights or a rope or anything that she could find in the home that could help her in strangulation of her victim. She would wrap whatever she found around their neck, make a knot, and place her forearm laterally on their back. This would prevent the victim from standing upright. She would then make the knot tighter, and when the victim was no longer able to breathe, they would collapse and she would let go. If the victim was taller than Juana, she would wrap the tights or rope or whatever she found in the home around the victim's neck, place both forearms on their upper back horizontally to bring them lower. This made it easier to strangulate them. She told Mexican officials that she would not physically touch her victims. The strangulation was solely done by the weapon of her choice. So Mexican authorities registered 49 cases from 1998 to 2006 that involved a crime by strangulation of elderly women. Mexican authorities were only able to prove Juana Barraza guilty of 16 of these cases. The remaining 32 cases have yet to be resolved. The names of the 49 victims are present in this slide.
Hello, I'm Natalie, and I'll be explaining her motive. Juana's motive for killing elderly women stemmed from deep-seated anger and desire for control rooted in her traumatic childhood. She was abused by her mother, forced into early motherhood, subjected to slavery, and sought empowerment through violence. Her choice of victims reflected unresolved hatred toward her mother. The act of killing became a compulsive means to assert control and gain satisfaction, allowing her to resolve the power dynamic she experienced as a helpless child. The tragic loss of her son intensified her anger, and in her distorted mindset, targeting elderly women symbolically avenged her own victimization. Next slide. Juana's modus operandi involved gaining entry to homes of elderly women through various ruses, such as posing as a nurse or government worker. Once inside, she would brutally beat and strangle her victims, often using different methods. The crimes were accompanied by burglary, with stolen items ranging from religious objects to just any of their items. The choice of elderly victims and the violent nature of the attacks reflected the complex psychological factors during her crimes. Next slide. She can be categorized with power and control serial killer. Her motives were primarily driven by a desire for control and empowerment. The acts of killing, especially targeting vulnerable elderly women, served as a means to assert dominance and reserve the power dynamic she experienced in her traumatic childhood. Unlike some other categories like visionary or mission-oriented killers, Juana's crimes were not guided by a specific ideology or vision, but rather just a compulsion to regain control and satisfy deep-seated anger arising from her abusive past. Next slide. Her childhood trauma. The external factors were childhood trauma, poverty and financial strain, lack of education, failed relationships, loss of a child, and the incarceration system. Childhood trauma. She experienced severe physical and sexual abuse during her childhood. This traumatic upbringing likely contributed to the development of her deep-seated anger, a distorted sense of control, and diminished capacity for empathy. Poverty and financial strain. She faced financial difficulties as a single mother. She resorted to criminal activities such as theft and burglary to support her income. Economic hardships could have increased her desperation and her lust for crime. Lack of education. She was limited in the education, and she may have restricted her employment opportunities, pushing her towards a life of crime and means of survival. Her failed relationships. She had tumultuous relationships, and failed marriages may have fueled her anger and resentment, contributing to a volatile emotional state. The loss of a child. The tragic mugging and death of Juana's eldest son in 1999 could have intensified her emotional distress and possibly contributed to her escalating violence. And the incarceration system. While she was in prison, Juana's access to programs or interventions that could have addressed her psychological issues may have actually limited them, potentially perpetuating her violent tendencies. Next slide, sorry.
Hello, I'm Jolene, and I will be discussing the prosecution, final disposition, and sentencing of Juana Barraza's case. Prosecution. On January 25th, 2006, after being caught while fleeing from one of her victims' home, 48-year-old Juana Barraza was detained by Mexican authorities. After being detained, the investigators realized the resemblance between Juana and the model created of the potential serial killer's face. She was tried in the spring of 2008 in Mexico City. The prosecutors revealed that they had fingerprint evidence to prove Juana's guilt in these crimes. Juana's fingerprints were linked to at least 10 murders out of the 40 murders that were being investigated as part of Juana's crimes. Juana confessed that she only murdered her most recent victim and 3 other women. She claimed she had nothing to do with the other murders. During her trial, Juana used her mother's treatment towards her as the justification of her murders. Prosecutors stated that although Juana might have committed her crimes due to the harsh and abusive treatment she received from her mother when she was a young girl, she was still very much conscious of her crimes and was required to take responsibility for all of them. Final disposition. On March 31st, 2008, Juana Barraza was found guilty. She was convicted of 16 charges of murder and aggravated burglary, as well as 11 separate counts of murder. Although officials believe that Juana was connected to over 40 murders, she could only be convicted for the murders that she could be tied to as fingerprint evidence. Juana stated that she would appeal against all but one of these convictions. Sentencing. She was sentenced to 759 years in prison. This is one of the longest sentences ever given in Mexico. Sentences given in Mexican courts are usually served concurrently, with the maximum sentence being 60 years under Mexican law. There is no death penalty or life sentence. Due to these circumstances, she will be paroled in 2058 when she is 100 years old. She is currently incarcerated at the Santa Marta de Acapulco prison in Mexico City. Next slide.
So we found a 3-minute video just summarizing what Juana Barraza did, and I will be showing it now.
Se hacía llamar la dama del silencio. Someone was killing elderly women in Mexico, strangling them with a stethoscope. Sus víctimas fueron ancianas que vivían solas. Se hacía pasar por enfermeras.
This is the very first time in Mexican history that police named and profiled a serial killer. Nicknamed El Mataviejitas. This means the little old lady killer.
La asesina serial cometió por lo menos 11 asesinatos. Police came up with a profile of the little old lady killer.
They were looking initially for a man, even though witnesses kept on saying that she was a woman that was wearing a wig, that had makeup, but they couldn't conceptualize of a female serial killer.
A break in the case happened by accident in early 2006.
A renter was coming home when he saw another woman that she was exiting the house, and after he saw his landlady lying on the floor, strangled dead, he started chasing this other woman that he had just seen exiting the house, crying out for help from police, and 2 police officers that were patrolling the area chased these women, and when they caught her, they said, "This is the serial killer we had been struggling to find."
The person the police caught defied their profile of a serial killer. Her name was Juana Barraza.
Juana Barraza is a professional lucha libre wrestler that has been profiled as the very first female serial killer of elderly women in Mexico City. Just 1 week before she was arrested and named the old lady killer, she appeared on national TV giving an interview saying that she was a fan of lucha libre and that she was rude from the bottom of her heart.
Police and media retroactively built a profile around Juana Barraza. They said her somewhat masculine appearance and her wrestling background helped prove that she was a serial killer, capable of killing elderly women. And she became a celebrity of sorts.
She has confessed to 1 murder, that is the one that she was caught red-handed for, and she's been sentenced to other 16. There are still more than 30 homicides against elderly women that we don't know who killed them.
Juana Barraza was sentenced to 759 years in prison.
I think that the long sentence, that is the largest one for any murder in Mexico City, speaks to Juana Barraza being criminalized for how she looks, for looking masculine, for being very muscular and robust, for being a wrestler, but she has not been made responsible for the killings. And there is a big difference between what you are and what you do. I argue that Juana Barraza is being punished and stigmatized and criminalized for what she is.
And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.